I watched in horror as Margaret Henderson pointed at my hand-built cabin and told the police officer standing next to her, "That illegal structure needs to be demolished immediately. I have all the documentation right here." The morning sun cast long shadows across my gravel driveway as 3 patrol cars and 2 county inspection vehicles surrounded my home. My coffee mug slipped from my trembling hands and shattered on the wooden porch I had built with my own sweat and determination. For months, this woman had made my life a living nightmare. Daily violation notices, surprise inspections, threats that grew more serious each week, all because my rustic cabin did not fit her vision of suburban perfection. But as I stood there watching her orchestrate what she believed would be my final defeat, Margaret had no idea about the secret I had been keeping. A secret that would turn her world upside down and give me the ultimate revenge. She was about to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with calloused hands and work boots holds all the cards. My name is David Miller, and for 32 years I have worked as a contractor in this county. Every sunrise brought another day of hard labor, building homes for other people while dreaming of the day I could create something special for myself. I saved every extra dollar for 15 years. While other guys my age bought expensive trucks or took fancy vacations, I kept my old pickup running and spent my weekends at home. My dream was simple but powerful. I wanted to own a piece of land where I could build something lasting with my own hands. When I found the 5-acre plot on Meadowbrook Road, I knew it was perfect. The property sat at the edge of Pine Valley Heights, a newer subdivision with an active homeowners association. My land was technically within the HOA boundaries, but far enough from the main neighborhood that I hoped to live peacefully without much interference. The cabin took me 3 years to complete, working evenings and weekends. Every beam was hand-selected. Every joint was crafted with precision. The rustic cedar siding came from a local mill, and I chose each board for its character and grain. The wraparound porch faced west, perfect for watching sunsets over the rolling hills beyond the subdivision. Those early morning hours on my porch became sacred to me. Steam rising from my coffee cup, birds calling from the old oak trees I had carefully preserved during construction. The satisfaction of knowing that every nail, every shingle, every piece of trim had been placed by hands that understood the value of honest work. My cabin was not fancy by suburban standards. I chose function over fashion, authenticity over appearance. The gravel driveway was practical for my work trucks. The natural landscaping required less water and maintenance than manicured lawns. Solar panels on the south-facing roof reduced my electric bills and felt good for the environment. From my porch, I could see the main neighborhood in the distance. Rows of nearly identical houses with perfect green lawns and matching mailboxes. Every driveway was paved. Every landscape was professionally maintained. It looked like a movie set where real life had been scrubbed away and replaced with artificial perfection. I respected their choice to live that way, but it was not for me. My happiness came from the morning ritual of checking my small vegetable garden, the evening satisfaction of sitting on wood I had cut and shaped myself, and the deep peace that comes from owning something you created with your own labor. For 2 years, I lived in blessed isolation. I waved to the occasional neighbor who drove past on their way to the main road. A few had stopped to compliment my craftsmanship or ask questions about my solar setup. Most seemed friendly enough, though we moved in different worlds. I should have known it was too good to last. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Official HOA letterhead. Formal language about property standards and community compliance. a list of alleged violations that made my blood pressure spike as I read them. Unpermitted structure, non-compliant exterior materials, violation of landscaping standards, unauthorized driveway surface. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee growing cold in my hand. Every item they listed was something I had researched carefully before building. My cabin met all county building codes. My landscaping was natural but well-maintained. My gravel driveway was practical and attractive. The letter was signed by Margaret Henderson, HOA compliance officer, and gave me 30 days to respond with a plan for correcting the violations. The tone was cold and official, but I tried to stay optimistic. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a polite conversation. I had no idea that Margaret Henderson was about to turn my peaceful dream into a nightmare that would test everything I believed about fairness, justice, and the power of determination. Margaret Henderson arrived at my property exactly 3 days after I received her letter. I was replacing a section of porch railing when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. A pristine white SUV pulled into my driveway, moving slowly and deliberately like a predator approaching its prey. The woman who emerged from the vehicle looked like she had stepped out of a suburban magazine. Perfectly styled blonde hair that had never seen a hard day of work. A crisp white blouse that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Dark slacks with a crease sharp enough to cut paper. But it was her expression that told me everything I needed to know. Cold eyes that surveyed my property like a general inspecting enemy territory. Lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Every step she took was calculated to demonstrate authority and superiority. "Mr. Miller, I presume." Her voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am Margaret Henderson, compliance officer for the Pine Valley Heights Homeowners Association." She carried a large clipboard and what appeared to be a professional measuring tape. A camera hung from a strap around her neck. This was not a friendly visit. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I got your letter. I was hoping we could discuss." "There is nothing to discuss until you understand the severity of your violations." She cut me off with the precision of a practiced bureaucrat. "This is an official inspection, and I need you to remain available for questions." I watched in growing amazement as she began documenting my property like a crime scene investigator. She photographed the cedar siding from multiple angles, muttering about non-approved materials. She measured the distance from my cabin to the property line, shaking her head with each calculation. "This rustic appearance is completely inappropriate for our community standards," she announced, not bothering to look at me as she spoke. "Pine Valley Heights maintains a certain aesthetic that protects property values for all residents." "But my property is barely within the HOA boundaries," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "And I followed all county building codes during construction." She finally looked directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes that was worse than mere disapproval. It was disgust. As if my work boots and flannel shirt represented everything she found offensive about the world. "Mr. Miller, you clearly do not understand how homeowners associations work. County codes are minimum standards. Our community covenant requires much higher standards of appearance and construction. Your gravel driveway alone violates 3 separate provisions." She consulted her clipboard and began reading violations like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Unauthorized exterior materials, non-compliant roofline, improper landscaping, unapproved driveway surface, excessive solar panel installation, non-conforming architectural style. Each word felt like a physical blow. These were not mere suggestions or preferences. She was treating them like criminal charges that could destroy everything I had worked to build. "Mrs. Henderson, I would be happy to work with you on any reasonable modifications." "Reasonable," she laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mr. Miller, people like you always think the rules should be bent to accommodate your lifestyle choices. That is not how civilized communities operate." "People like you." The phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I have 30 years of experience in construction and property development," I said quietly. "I understand building codes and community standards. If you could specify exactly what modifications you need." "I need complete compliance with our architectural guidelines, or I need you to find somewhere else to live." Her smile was as cold as winter frost. "This is not a negotiation, Mr. Miller. This is official notice that your property violates multiple HOA covenants." She handed me a folder thick with documents: bylaws, architectural guidelines, enforcement procedures. The papers felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the power to destroy my peaceful life. "You have 60 days to submit a complete remediation plan, or we will begin legal proceedings to force compliance. Daily fines begin immediately at $100 per violation per day. That comes to $700 daily until you fix this mess." $700 a day. The number hit me like a sledgehammer. At that rate, she could bankrupt me in a matter of weeks. Margaret Henderson climbed back into her pristine SUV and rolled down the window for one final comment. "Mr. Miller, I hope you understand that we take community standards very seriously in Pine Valley Heights. Your cooperation in this matter will determine whether this process is quick and simple or long and expensive." As she drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging over my gravel driveway, I stood holding the folder of regulations and feeling like a man who had just been declared war upon by an enemy he had never met. I spent the next week buried in HOA documents, trying to understand exactly what Margaret Henderson wanted from me. The architectural guidelines were 73 pages of dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Every paragraph contained multiple subsections with cross-references to other documents. My kitchen table became a war room covered with building codes, HOA bylaws, and legal statutes. I made charts comparing county requirements with HOA standards. I researched every violation she had listed, looking for ways to compromise that would satisfy her demands without destroying the character of my home. On Thursday morning, I called the HOA office and requested a meeting to discuss possible solutions. Margaret agreed to see me that afternoon, and I arrived with a detailed proposal that addressed each of her concerns. "Mrs. Henderson, I have prepared a compliance plan that should satisfy the major violations while preserving the structural integrity of my cabin." She glanced at my folder without opening it. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your effort, but partial compliance is not acceptable. Our standards require complete conformity with architectural guidelines." "But some of these changes would require tearing down and rebuilding major sections of my home. The cost would be—" "The cost of noncompliance is much higher than the cost of doing things correctly from the beginning." Her tone suggested that my financial concerns were irrelevant to her decision-making process. I tried a different approach. What if I focused on the most important violations first? The landscaping and driveway could be modified relatively easily. "Mr. Miller, you seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It is not. You will comply fully with all community standards, or You will face the consequences of your choices." The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. She dismissed every suggestion I made and refused to consider any compromise. It became clear that her goal was not compliance but complete surrender. The harassment began the next week. Daily violation notices appeared on my door, citing new infractions that had somehow escaped her initial inspection. Excessive bird feeder height, non-approved welcome mat, unauthorized decorative elements. She began showing up for surprise inspections at random times, 6 in the morning, 8 at night, always with her clipboard and camera, always finding new problems that needed immediate correction. My few visitors started getting approached by Margaret or her supporters. The mail carrier mentioned that someone had asked him about suspicious activity at my address. A delivery driver told me that a woman had questioned him about what he was bringing to my property. The psychological pressure was constant and deliberate. Phone calls to my worksite, claiming I was operating an illegal business from my home. Letters to the county building department, requesting reinspection of my permits. Complaints to the sheriff about noise violations during my normal evening activities. I realized that Margaret had allies on the HOA board who rubber-stamped her every action. Tom Bradley, the board president, was a retired insurance executive who seemed to enjoy flexing his authority. Lisa Chen, the treasurer, ran every meeting like a corporate boardroom where dissent was not tolerated. They had created a system where compliance was impossible and resistance was futile. Every interaction was documented. Every conversation was treated as evidence. They spoke in legal terminology designed to intimidate anyone who challenged their authority. "Mr. Miller, your pattern of noncompliance demonstrates a willful disregard for community standards," Margaret announced during one of her surprise visits. "We are prepared to place liens on your property and pursue foreclosure if necessary." Foreclosure. The word hit me like a physical blow. They were talking about taking my home, my life's work, my dream, and selling it to pay their legal fees and fines. That night, I sat on my porch trying to understand how my peaceful life had become a battlefield. The sunset was beautiful as always, but I could barely see it through the stress and anger that clouded my vision. Margaret Henderson had made this personal. She was not enforcing rules for the good of the community. She was exercising power for the pleasure of dominating someone she considered beneath her social status. But I had underestimated her ruthlessness. 2 weeks later, she played her ultimate card, the one that would bring my world crashing down and force me to make a choice that would change everything. She called the county building inspector and the police, claiming that my cabin was an illegal structure that posed safety risks to the community. I was drinking my morning coffee on the porch when I heard the sound of multiple vehicles turning into my driveway. At first, I thought it might be a work crew that had taken a wrong turn. Then I saw the flashing lights and official markings, and my blood turned to ice water. 3 police cars, 2 county inspection vehicles, a code enforcement truck. They moved up my gravel driveway in formation like a military convoy preparing for battle. Margaret Henderson emerged from her white SUV and strode toward the official vehicles with the confidence of a general commanding her troops. She carried her ever-present clipboard and wore an expression of grim satisfaction that told me everything I needed to know about who had orchestrated this invasion. Officer Rodriguez approached my porch while the inspectors began unloading their equipment. He was a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, but his duty was clear. "Mr. Miller, we have received complaints about potential building code violations and safety hazards. These gentlemen need to inspect your structure and determine if it meets county standards. Officer, I have all my building permits and inspection certificates. Everything was done according to code when I built this cabin. That may be, sir, but we have to investigate all complaints. Please cooperate with the inspectors and this process will go as smoothly as possible. I watched helplessly as strangers with clipboards and measuring devices swarmed over my home like ants dissecting a fallen apple. Every detail I had crafted with love and pride was being examined, questioned, and documented as potential evidence of wrongdoing. Margaret positioned herself near the lead inspector, pointing out problems and providing commentary like a prosecutor presenting her case to a jury. I could not hear everything she was saying, but her body language spoke volumes about her satisfaction with the morning's events. Sir, when was this structure built? Inspector Williams consulted his tablet while examining my foundation. I completed it in 2019. All permits and inspections were current at that time. Well, we have some problems here. The electrical panel does not meet current code requirements. The deck railing height is 3 inches below current standards, and this solar installation appears to exceed what was approved in the original permit. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. Building codes had been updated since my construction was completed. They were applying current standards to a structure that had been legally compliant when it was built. Inspector Williams, those codes were changed after my cabin was completed. Everything met the requirements that were in effect during construction. He shook his head sympathetically. I understand your frustration, sir, but we have to enforce current safety standards regardless of when the work was done. Public safety takes priority over grandfather clauses. Margaret Henderson approached with a smile that could have frozen fire. Mr. Miller, I tried to work with you on voluntary compliance. Unfortunately, your refusal to cooperate has forced us to involve official authorities. Mrs. Henderson, you know this is a setup. You are using retroactive code changes to destroy something that was perfectly legal when I built it. I am protecting the safety and property values of our community, she replied with practiced righteousness. Your illegal structure poses risks that we cannot ignore. Inspector Williams returned with a clipboard full of violations. Mr. Miller, I am required to issue a stop work order until these safety issues can be addressed. You will also receive a formal notice of violations that must be corrected within 30 days. And if I cannot correct violations that are based on codes that did not exist when I built this cabin. His expression was genuinely apologetic. Then we would have to pursue demolition proceedings to protect public safety. Demolition. The word hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were talking about tearing down my home, my life's work, my American dream, because of paperwork and political power games. Margaret Henderson handed me a thick envelope with the smug satisfaction of someone who had just won a chess match. Mr. Miller, this contains formal notice of HOA legal proceedings. We are seeking immediate compliance with all community standards, plus reimbursement for legal fees and daily fines that now total $43,000. $43,000. I stared at the number on the legal document and felt my future collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Even if I could somehow address the building code issues, the HOA fines alone would bankrupt me. As the official vehicles departed, leaving me standing alone in the dust of my own driveway, I realized that Margaret Henderson had played her hand perfectly. She had used the system like a weapon, turning laws and regulations into tools of personal destruction. That night, I sat on my porch and looked out at the sunset that might be one of my last from this beautiful spot. The cabin around me felt different now, marked for destruction by forces I could not fight with hammer and nails. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the work of my own hands and facing the loss of everything I had built, something began to change inside me. The despair was being replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Margaret Henderson thought she had won. She thought she had broken me with her bureaucratic warfare and legal intimidation. She had no idea that her victory celebration was premature. She was about to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with calloused hands knows how to fight back in ways that perfectly manicured bullies never see coming. That night, sitting alone on my porch with demolition notices scattered on the table beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. Margaret Henderson had used the system as a weapon against me. It was time to turn that same system against her. Most people in Pine Valley Heights had no idea about my background before I became a contractor. For 6 years after college, I had worked as a municipal code enforcement officer in the next county. I knew building regulations, zoning laws, and HOA legal procedures better than most attorneys. Margaret assumed I was just another blue-collar worker who could be intimidated by legal paperwork and official authority. She had no idea that I understood every tactic she was using because I had seen them used before. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I should have done from the beginning. Instead of trying to defend myself against her attacks, I went on the offensive. Every evening after work, I researched HOA compliance records, building permits, and municipal violations throughout Pine Valley Heights. What I discovered was better than I had dared to hope. Margaret Henderson lived at 2247 Maple Grove Lane in a house that featured a beautiful deck addition overlooking her professionally landscaped backyard. According to county records, no permit had ever been issued for that deck. The structure violated setback requirements by 4 feet and exceeded height limitations by 18 inches. Her privacy fence, which created perfect borders around her manicured lawn, was 8 feet tall in a zone that restricted fencing to 6 feet maximum. The decorative gate entrance included electrical components that had never been inspected or approved by county officials. But the best discovery came when I researched the HOA's own compliance with municipal regulations. The community clubhouse had been expanded in 2018 without proper permits. The swimming pool maintenance building violated environmental regulations for chemical storage. Even the fancy entrance sign exceeded height restrictions for commercial displays. Margaret Henderson and her HOA board had been systematically violating the same types of codes they were using to destroy my life. While I was documenting their violations, I discovered something else that would prove even more valuable. 3 months earlier, the HOA had held elections for board positions. Most residents ignored these elections, typically resulting in the same power-hungry individuals keeping control year after year. But this time was different. A group of fed-up homeowners had organized a quiet campaign to change the board composition. They were tired of arbitrary enforcement, excessive fines, and the reign of terror that Margaret had created in the community. I had been so focused on my construction work and my legal troubles that I had completely missed the election. When I checked the results, I discovered something that made my hands shake with excitement. David Miller had been elected to the HOA Board of Directors with 73 votes. More importantly, the anti-Margaret coalition had won enough seats to elect me as the new HOA president. Margaret Henderson had been so confident in her power and so dismissive of the little people. She was crushing that she had never bothered to verify the election results. She assumed that apathy and intimidation would keep her enemies from organizing against her. She was wrong. I spent 2 more weeks preparing for war. I documented every instance of harassment, every arbitrary enforcement action, every abuse of power that Margaret had committed during her campaign against me. I researched HOA legal procedures and discovered that board members could be removed for misconduct and abuse of authority. Most importantly, I prepared formal violation notices for every code violation I had discovered on Margaret's property and throughout the community. If she wanted to play enforcement games, I was ready to show her what real enforcement looked like. The monthly HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community clubhouse. Margaret expected routine business and easy victories. She had no idea that she was walking into an ambush that would end her reign of terror forever. On Wednesday night, I made one final review of my documentation: photographs of violations, copies of permits and inspection records, legal precedents for board member removal, evidence of selective enforcement and harassment campaigns. Margaret Henderson had taught me that the system could be a powerful weapon in the hands of someone who understood how to use it. She was about to discover that lesson worked both ways. As I prepared for sleep, I looked out my bedroom window at the cabin that had almost been taken from me. Tomorrow night, Margaret would learn that sometimes the quiet guy with work boots and calloused hands holds all the cards. She was about to discover that David Miller was not just a contractor who built cabins. He was the new president of the Pine Valley Heights Homeowners Association. The Pine Valley Heights Community Clubhouse buzzed with more activity than usual for a monthly board meeting. Word had somehow spread that tonight's session might be more interesting than the typical discussions of landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. Margaret Henderson entered the room with her usual commanding presence, clipboard in hand and confidence radiating from every step. She had no idea that her world was about to collapse around her perfectly styled hair. Tom Bradley, the outgoing board president, called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. First item on tonight's agenda is the election of new board officers following last month's member elections. I watched Margaret's face carefully as Tom announced the election results that she had ignored for 3 months. Her expression shifted from boredom to confusion to growing horror as the reality of the situation penetrated her consciousness. David Miller received 73 votes and has been elected as the new president of the Pine Valley Heights Homeowners Association. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned to stare at me sitting quietly in the back row, and I saw the exact moment when she realized that everything had changed. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, carrying the folder that contained 3 weeks of research and documentation. Every eye in the clubhouse followed my movement as I took my place at the head table. Thank you, Tom. Before we proceed with tonight's business, I need to address some serious compliance issues that have come to my attention. Margaret found her voice, though it lacked its usual authority. Mr. Miller, I think there has been some mistake. You cannot simply. Mrs. Henderson, you are no longer in charge of this meeting or this community. I am the duly elected president, and you will follow proper meeting procedures like everyone else. The power shift was immediate and visible. For months, Margaret had dominated every interaction through sheer force of personality and assumed authority. Now she was just another resident facing accountability for her actions. I opened my folder and began presenting the evidence systematically. Over the past 3 months, I have documented numerous violations of HOA procedures, county regulations, and basic standards of fair treatment. The first photograph showed Margaret's unpermitted deck addition. Gasps rippled through the audience as I explained how she had violated the same building codes she was using to destroy my cabin. This structure violates setback requirements by 4 feet and height restrictions by 18 inches. According to the standards Mrs. Henderson has been enforcing, it should be demolished immediately. Her face turned pale as I continued with photographs of her non-compliant fence, the unpermitted electrical work at her gate, and multiple violations throughout the community that had been ignored, while she focused her enforcement efforts on targeting me. But more serious than these building violations is the pattern of harassment and selective enforcement that Mrs. Henderson has used to terrorize residents who do not meet her personal standards. I read excerpts from the harassment documentation I had compiled: daily violation notices for imaginary infractions, threats of foreclosure for minor issues, intimidation of visitors and service providers. The audience listened in stunned silence as I detailed the systematic abuse of power that had been occurring under their noses. One by one, other homeowners began standing up to share their own stories of Margaret's tyranny. Mrs. Patterson described threats over her garden gnomes. Mr. Johnson explained how Margaret had tried to fine him for parking his work truck in his own driveway. The stories accumulated like evidence in a criminal trial. "Mrs. Henderson," I continued, "you have violated your fiduciary duty to this community and abused your authority for personal satisfaction rather than legitimate enforcement." Margaret finally exploded with the rage she had been suppressing. "You people have no idea what it takes to maintain property values and community standards. Someone has to enforce the rules, or this place becomes a slum." "Enforcing rules fairly and legally is one thing," I replied calmly. "Using rules as weapons to destroy people you consider beneath you is something completely different." The board vote was unanimous. Margaret Henderson was formally censured for abuse of authority and removed from all enforcement duties. She would be required to correct the violations on her own property according to the same standards she had demanded from others. But the real victory came with the policy changes I implemented as the new president: fair enforcement procedures, appeal processes for disputed violations, transparency requirements for board decisions, protection against harassment and selective enforcement. The Pine Valley Heights Homeowners Association will operate according to principles of fairness, respect, and community service, I announced to the packed room. We will enforce legitimate standards without destroying people's lives or dreams. As the meeting concluded, Margaret gathered her papers with trembling hands and headed for the exit. At the door, she turned back for one final comment: "This is not over, Mr. Miller." I looked directly into her eyes and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, it is." 6 months later, I sit on my porch every morning with the same cup of coffee and the same beautiful sunrise, but everything else has changed. The stack of violation notices and legal threats has been replaced by thank you cards from neighbors and invitations to community events. My cabin stands exactly as I built it, now officially approved and protected under new HOA guidelines that recognize the value of architectural diversity. The solar panels still gleam in the morning sun. The gravel driveway still crunches under the tires of visitors who no longer get interrogated about their business here. Margaret Henderson still lives in the community, but her unpermitted deck has been modified to meet code requirements. Her oversized fence has been lowered to legal height. She follows the same rules as everyone else now, without special privileges or authority to terrorize her neighbors. The transformation of Pine Valley Heights has been remarkable. Under fair enforcement policies, residents have become more cooperative rather than more defiant. Property maintenance has actually improved now that people are working with the HOA instead of against it. We established a community garden where Mrs. Patterson's garden gnomes have become beloved fixtures. Mr. Johnson parks his work truck with pride, knowing that honest labor is respected here. The clubhouse hosts monthly potlucks where neighbors share stories and build genuine community connections. My role as HOA president has taught me something important about leadership. Real authority comes from service and respect, not from fear and intimidation. When you treat people with dignity, they respond with cooperation and pride in their community. The legal costs and fines that Margaret imposed have been forgiven for all residents who were victims of her harassment campaign. We redirected HOA resources from enforcement litigation to community improvements that benefit everyone. Sometimes I see Margaret at community events, and we maintain polite but distant relations. She learned that bullying has consequences, and I learned that sometimes fighting back is the only way to protect what you love. The quiet contractor with calloused hands and work boots became an unlikely leader who proved that ordinary people can stand up to petty tyrants and win. But more importantly, I discovered that leadership is not about power over others, but about service to your community. My cabin represents more than just a place to live now. It stands as proof that authentic dreams can survive bureaucratic nightmares when you refuse to surrender to injustice. Every sunrise reminds me that sometimes the system can be reformed by people who understand that rules should serve communities, not the other way around. Margaret Henderson thought she could destroy my American dream with paperwork and intimidation. Instead, she taught me that I had the power to protect everyone's dreams by standing up for what is right. The coffee tastes better now. The sunrise looks brighter, and my cabin will stand here as long as I do, protected by fair laws and surrounded by a community that values both standards and compassion. Justice, it turns out, tastes a lot like morning coffee on a hand-built porch.